For the last few weeks of our worship gatherings, we've had our eyes fixed on the strange and compelling narrative of Numbers. This is Israel's road trip diary, a chronicle of their journey through the wilderness. For centuries, they'd lived as a slave caste of people in Egypt, but God had set them free, and now He was taking them to this place where they would make a home, where they could farm their own lands, where they could raise children, where they could worship together, and where God would live among them. This promised land had been lodged in the memory banks of the Israelite people since the time of their ancestor Abraham, and now they were closer than ever to its fulfillment. In fact, they're right on the front lawn of this new homeland. In Numbers 13, it's God Himself who gives Moses the commandment to send out 12 scouts to investigate what would become Israel's new digs. Now, I assume that God already knew precisely what the land was like and what was going on there. He's had some time to check it out over His infinite existence, not to mention the fact that He made this land and everything in it. So, I do wonder, why did God find it important to have Moses send these 12 spies into the land? It wasn't for God's sake. This is not a situation where God, who had ordered some cool gadget on Amazon as a gift for Israel, is then excited and curious to see the package unboxed when it arrives to see if he got what he thought he was paying for. I imagine that God had Moses send the 12 scouts out for some reason, the sake of Israel, I guess, but the text never really provides God's rationale. Moses does as he told. The 12 scouts, each representing different ancestral tribes, are sent out with instructions to collect any and all intel on the promised land. Is it good? What kinds of trees are there? Do they produce fruit? Could they bring back some samples of the produce? And what are the cities of the land like? Are they fortified? Do they have walls or not? The scouts go, and the scouts return from their mission after 40 days with a huge, juicy cluster of grapes in tow. And then the scouts give this report, or rather reports. There are actually two very different accounts given to the community by the spies, a majority report and a minority report. And the gap between the two perspectives is giant-sized. The majority report, 10 out of the 12 spies, first expresses that the land is a good land flowing with milk and honey. I mean, who could argue with that top-notch fruit basket that they bring with them as proof? But as the majority group tells their community, there are already a lot of people who are inhabiting that land. And I don't think that God told them that He promised this place to Israel. And these people are strong, they say, powerful. Their cities are like fortresses. The minority report, on the other hand, two of the 12 scouts, men named Caleb and Joshua, speak up, and they simply say, we should go take this land. We can certainly conquer it. That's when the first 10 spies push back, and as they lean further and further into their own slanted version of the facts, their anxiety, their fear, their pessimism, hopelessness, and the shadows of the Canaanite inhabitants all start to grow and grow and grow. At the start of the spies reporting back, the Canaanites are described as strong, but by the end of the chapter, these 10 men are supersizing the Canaanites. They're not just strong, they are huge. They are giants, people of mythological proportion. And the land that at first they said was good and flowing with milk and honey, now it's described by these frightened spies at the end of the narrative as a place that will devour anyone who goes there. I wonder if you've ever had that experience where the more you focus on something that is causing you distress, something that's causing you to fret, the worse it seems in your own mind. The more it grows, the more giant size it becomes. It's like that snowball effect. The chapter ends as the 10 scouts say this in 1333, we looked like grasshoppers in our own eyes. And that's how we seem to them too. They'd convinced themselves and worked to convince the rest of the Israelite community that the dangers of the new land are too great and that the Canaanite people are too powerful, that they didn't have any chance to take that land. In their own eyes, they were like grasshoppers, little bugs, and they think that's how the Canaanites must see them too. It's ironic, but actually, if you keep reading a few chapters further into Numbers to the beginning of chapter 22, the Balaam narrative, you encounter a story that shows the complete opposite of this. As Israel is there perched at the edge of the promised land, the perspective of one of these Canaanite kingdoms that is already living in the promised land was that Israel is actually powerful. Israel is a thriving, scary country to them. There are people outside the camp of Israel who are perceiving the faithful kindness of God to his people, his provision, his abundance, in the same way that allowed Caleb and Joshua to say, let's keep going, God is with us. So keep this in mind. All 12 of these spies who scouted the land see the same thing. They all went on the same scouting mission. So what can account for the two very different reports? Such drastically different perspectives. On the one hand, we're insects. We'll be killed if we go any further. And then on the other hand, we should keep going. We've got this land. Human beings, I think, are meaning-making creatures. We bear the image of a meaning-making God. We look at every situation and process the data, not only for what it is, but for what it means. The majority group of spies looked at the people in the cities of the Promised Land and thought, this means we will get squashed by these people if we proceed. Whereas the remaining two spies, Caleb and Joshua, saw the people, their fortified cities, and the good, fruitful land, and they thought, let's continue forward. Despite the opposition, we will take hold of what God has promised. I read a stat report the other day about life in Canadian cities, perspectives in the midst of the global pandemic. It was a fairly recent study put out this summer. Their polling research indicated that 34%, so more than a third of Canadians in the midst of the global pandemic, expected their financial situation to worsen in the next 6 months, and that 30% expect their overall quality of life will worsen in the next 6 months. Those stats were actually less alarming to me than these, that 56% saw others around them as more dangerous than they ever have before, and 82% of Canadians said the world feels like a riskier place to live for now. For many of us, for many of our neighbors, it seems like the giants are growing taller and stronger. What about you? How are you feeling going into this fall, looking at what's ahead? I want to be clear that this story and this sermon is not just a limp little commercial for keeping a cheery disposition and a smile on your face, an eternally optimistic point of view in all circumstances. That's trite. That's stupid. What I think this text invites us to is an honest assessment of the facts of life, to scout out what's actually happening around us in the world, and then to interpret those things in a way that relentlessly holds on to the realities of God's presence to his people, God's character being one of love and faithfulness, God's provision for our needs, and his promises for the fullness of redemption. My hope is that you can go read this story today or at some point over this long weekend and do some reflecting on the state of your mind and your heart as you come into this fall. My hope is that you'll see in the example of the majority report spies a warning bell for how our fears and unfaith can get the best of us and be what prevents us from continuing forward in God's intentions for us. And my hope is that you can see in the courageous example of Caleb and Joshua an invitation to push ahead into what's next with a deep trust in God's promises and God's presence and God's abundance. Let's go ahead. God is with us. Amen.